I'm Sadie Mitchell, 24 years old, and I'm standing outside in the freezing December snow on Christmas Eve, clutching a single duffel bag with everything I own. My parents just suspended my Harvard law education and threw me out of the house until I apologized to their precious golden boy, my adopted brother Brandon. But what they don't know is that my phone is buzzing with a call from a lawyer about my grandmother's secret will. They thought suspending my education would break me, but they had no idea what grandmother left me. Before we dive into this incredible story of family betrayal and ultimate justice, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments, hit that like button if you're ready for some serious family drama, and don't forget to subscribe because this story has more twists than a roller coaster. Trust me, you won't believe what happens when the truth finally comes out. Let me take you back to understand how I ended up in this nightmare. My father Robert Mitchell built a successful real estate empire from nothing, turning our family into one of the wealthiest in Boston. My mother Linda ran the marketing department for a high-end fashion company, and together they created this picture-perfect image of the American dream. I was their only biological child, the daughter who was supposed to carry on their legacy. I worked my tail off to get into Harvard Law School, maintaining a 4.0 GPA while juggling 3 part-time jobs to help with expenses, even though my family could afford to pay my tuition 10 times over. Then there was Brandon. He came into our lives when I was 8 years old and he was 6, a tragic case of a little boy who lost both parents in a horrific car accident. My parents decided to adopt him, and from day one, something shifted in our household dynamic that I couldn't quite understand as a child. Brandon wasn't just welcomed into our family, he became the center of it. While I had to earn every privilege, every dollar of spending money, every moment of my parents' attention, Brandon received everything freely and abundantly. He got the biggest bedroom in the house, the one with the bay window and walk-in closet that I had been promised for my 13th birthday. When he turned 16, my parents bought him a brand new BMW while I was still riding the city bus to my after-school job. His private school tuition at the prestigious Brookfield Academy was paid without question, while I had to present detailed budgets and justifications for every Harvard-related expense. The worst part wasn't the material favoritism, though that stung enough. It was watching my academic achievements, my leadership roles, my scholarship awards get overshadowed by Brandon's mediocre efforts that were praised as if he'd cured cancer. When I made law review at Harvard, my parents spent dinner talking about how proud they were that Brandon had managed to pass his freshman year at Boston College with a 2.5 GPA. When I won the regional moot court competition, they were more excited about Brandon making the intramural soccer team. I started to wonder if they even remembered they had a biological daughter, or if I was just the practice child they'd used to figure out parenting before their real son came along. The breaking point came 3 weeks before Christmas, during what should have been Brandon's final exam period of his junior year. I was home for winter break, buried in my own final papers, when my parents received a call from Boston College's Dean of Academic Affairs. Brandon had been caught red-handed cheating on his constitutional law final exam. Not just looking at someone else's paper, but running an elaborate scheme where he'd photographed test questions with his phone and was texting answers to other students in exchange for payment. The evidence was ironclad. Security cameras, text message records, witness statements from other students who reported his behavior. But somehow, in the twisted logic of my family's dynamics, this became my fault. Brandon came home that evening with tears streaming down his face, throwing himself into my mother's arms like a wounded child. He spun this elaborate tale about how I had been sabotaging him all semester, feeding information to his professors about his study habits, spreading rumors about his character, and ultimately reporting his innocent mistake to the administration out of jealousy and sibling rivalry. He claimed I couldn't stand that he was finally succeeding academically and had orchestrated his downfall to protect my position as the family's academic star. The truth was that I'd never spoken to a single person at Boston College about Brandon. I barely knew what classes he was taking, let alone had any involvement in his academic life. But Brandon was a master manipulator, and he knew exactly which emotional buttons to push with our parents. He painted himself as the victim of a vindictive sister who couldn't bear to share the spotlight, who was so threatened by his success that she'd go to any length to destroy him. The family meeting that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. My parents called me into the formal dining room, the one we only used for major holidays and serious discussions. Brandon sat between them, still playing the role of the wounded victim, while I was positioned across the table like a defendant facing prosecution. The lighting was dim, the atmosphere heavy with accusation and disappointment. Before I could even speak, my father launched into a lecture about family loyalty and the destructive nature of jealousy. Brandon had prepared for this moment like a lawyer building a case. He produced printed screenshots of text messages that supposedly showed me talking to his classmates about his personal struggles. The messages looked real at first glance, but I knew I'd never sent them because I didn't even have contact information for any of his friends. He had transcripts of alleged phone calls where I supposedly spoke to his professors about his character flaws, complete with dates and times that placed me at Harvard during periods when these calls supposedly occurred. Most damning of all, he had a sworn statement from his roommate claiming that I had visited their dorm room multiple times, asking pointed questions about Brandon's study schedule and academic performance. Every piece of evidence was fabricated, but it was sophisticated enough to fool my parents, who were already predisposed to believe that Brandon could do no wrong. When I tried to explain that I'd never been to Brandon's dorm, that I didn't know his classmates' phone numbers, that I'd been in Harvard's library during the times these alleged conversations took place, my parents cut me off. My mother's face was cold and distant in a way I'd never seen before, and my father's disappointment was palpable. The betrayal from extended family members hit even harder than my parents' blindness. My Aunt Alice, my father's younger sister, had always been my confidant and supporter. She was the one who helped me navigate the college application process when my parents were too focused on Brandon's high school graduation. She was the one who attended my Harvard Law School orientation when my parents had to miss it for one of Brandon's soccer tournaments. But when she arrived at the house that evening, supposedly to mediate the situation, she immediately sided with Brandon. She looked me in the eye and told me that she was disappointed in my behavior, that jealousy was unbecoming in a young woman of my intelligence, and that I owed Brandon a sincere apology for trying to sabotage his education. Even worse was the involvement of Dr. Margaret Stone, my mother's best friend and a licensed psychologist who had known me since childhood. She arrived with a folder full of notes and observations, claiming that she'd been watching my behavior toward Brandon for years and had noticed troubling patterns of resentment and competitive behavior. She spoke in clinical terms about sibling rivalry, academic pressure, and the psychological profile of high-achieving individuals who couldn't tolerate competition. She recommended family therapy, with a focus on helping me work through my obvious jealousy issues and learn to celebrate Brandon's successes instead of undermining them. The most devastating betrayal came from Jake, my boyfriend of 5 years who I thought knew me better than anyone. We'd met during my sophomore year at Harvard, and he'd seen firsthand how hard I worked, how honest I was, how much I valued integrity in all aspects of my life. But when Brandon's accusations became public knowledge in our social circle, Jake started pulling away. He stopped returning my calls promptly, canceled our weekend plans, and when we did spend time together, I could see doubt in his eyes. He never directly accused me of anything, but his changed behavior spoke louder than words. The man who once told me I was the most honest person he'd ever known was now questioning everything he thought he knew about my character. Meanwhile, Brandon was escalating his psychological warfare. He hacked into my Harvard email account using information he'd gathered over the years about my passwords and security questions. He sent threatening messages to Professor Williams, my constitutional law professor, supposedly from my account, demanding preferential treatment and making accusations about grading bias. He forged my signature on anonymous complaint forms submitted to the Harvard Law Review, claiming that the editorial process was rigged and that I deserved special consideration because of my family's financial contributions to the university. Most insidiously, he hired a private investigator to follow me around Cambridge, photographing me entering buildings, meeting with study groups, and visiting the library at odd hours, then presented these photos to my parents as evidence of my suspicious behavior and secretive nature. The investigation at Harvard began quietly, but word spread quickly through the tight-knit law school community. Suddenly, classmates who had respected my work and valued my contributions to study groups were looking at me with suspicion. My study group disbanded without explanation. Professors who had once been mentors became formally polite but distant. My academic reputation, which I'd spent 6 years building through hard work and dedication, was crumbling based on fabricated evidence and manipulated perceptions. Brandon wasn't content with just damaging my academic reputation. He wanted to destroy every aspect of my life systematically, and he possessed a level of technological sophistication that I had severely underestimated. Using software that he'd apparently been learning about for months, he created deepfake videos that appeared to show me in compromising situations. One video allegedly showed me offering money to Professor Williams in exchange for better grades, filmed in what looked like his office but was actually a careful recreation that Brandon had constructed in a rented space. Another video seemed to capture me purchasing illegal stimulants from a dealer near Harvard Square, supposedly to enhance my academic performance and gain an unfair advantage over other students. These videos were expertly crafted, using voice cloning technology and facial mapping software that made them nearly indistinguishable from reality to the untrained eye. Brandon distributed them strategically, first to university administrators as anonymous tips about academic misconduct, then to my parents as proof of my moral decay, and finally to select members of our extended family and social circle to ensure that my reputation was thoroughly destroyed across all areas of my life. The drug allegations were particularly devastating because they played into existing stereotypes about high-pressure academic environments and student desperation. Brandon planted prescription stimulants in my bedroom during one of my visits home, then arranged for my mother to discover them while doing laundry. He had researched the exact medications that students commonly abused for academic enhancement, complete with dosage information and fake prescription labels that made it appear I'd been obtaining them illegally for months. When my parents confronted me about the pills, I was genuinely confused and horrified, but my shock and denial only convinced them further that I was lying. The financial manipulation was equally sophisticated. Brandon had gained access to my banking information through years of observing my online habits and personal information. He created a series of transactions that made it appear I was receiving payments from various sources in exchange for academic favors. Money would appear in my account from anonymous sources, stay for just long enough to create a paper trail, then disappear again. When my parents' accountant reviewed my finances at their request, the pattern looked like clear evidence of academic corruption and unethical behavior. My isolation became complete when Jake finally confronted me directly about the allegations. We met at our favorite coffee shop near Harvard Square, a place where we'd spent countless hours studying together and planning our future. He laid out printed copies of the fabricated evidence, his voice shaking as he told me that he couldn't reconcile the person he thought he loved with the person described in these documents. He said he'd tried to defend me to mutual friends, but the evidence was too overwhelming to ignore. Even worse, he revealed that Brandon had reached out to him directly, expressing concern about my mental health and suggesting that my academic pressure had pushed me into dangerous and unethical behavior. The conversation with Jake was devastating not just because it ended our 5-year relationship, but because it showed me how thoroughly Brandon had poisoned every aspect of my life. Jake had been my emotional anchor, the person who believed in me unconditionally, and watching doubt creep into his eyes was more painful than any punishment my parents could devise. When he told me he needed time and space to figure out who I really was, I knew that Brandon had won a crucial psychological victory. My best friend Melissa delivered another crushing blow when she called to cancel our traditional Christmas shopping trip. Her voice was uncomfortable and formal, completely different from the warm, intimate tone we'd shared since middle school. She explained that her parents were concerned about her association with me given the ongoing investigation at Harvard and the rumors circulating in our community. She emphasized that she wasn't making a judgment about my guilt or innocence, but that she needed to protect her own reputation during her final year of medical school. The conditional nature of her friendship became crystal clear in that moment. Even Mrs. Garcia, our family's housekeeper who had been with us for 12 years and had watched me grow up, began treating me with suspicion and fear. Brandon had convinced her that I was dangerous and unstable, capable of lashing out at anyone who crossed me. He told her that I'd threatened to report her immigration status if she ever testified against me, which was not only false but completely contrary to everything I believed about human dignity and justice. Mrs. Garcia had been like a second mother to me during my childhood, teaching me Spanish and sharing stories about her family in El Salvador, but Brandon's manipulation poisoned even that pure relationship. The psychological pressure was crushing. I found myself confined to my childhood bedroom, stripped of my phone and laptop, forbidden from leaving the house without supervision. My parents installed monitoring software on the family computer and required me to provide detailed schedules of my activities when I was allowed brief supervised outings. They treated me like a criminal awaiting trial, which in their minds, I was. During those long days of isolation, I began to question my own memories and perceptions. When everyone around you insists that you've done terrible things, when people who have known you your entire life look at you with fear and disappointment, when evidence that looks real but feels impossible continues to accumulate against you, doubt starts to creep into your own mind. I found myself wondering if I could have somehow blocked out memories of harmful actions, if the academic pressure had actually driven me to behavior that I couldn't acknowledge or remember. The gaslighting was so complete and sophisticated that I sometimes caught myself wondering if Brandon might actually be telling the truth about some aspects of his accusations. Maybe I had been unconsciously competitive with him over the years. Maybe my resentment of the favoritism he received had manifested in ways I wasn't fully aware of. Maybe the person I thought I was, honest and principled and hardworking, was just a self-serving delusion that protected me from acknowledging my darker impulses. Christmas Eve arrived with the weight of an ultimatum that would determine the rest of my life. My parents had invited their usual holiday guests, extended family, business associates, close friends, for their annual Christmas Eve celebration. The house was decorated with elegant garlands and twinkling lights, the dining room table set with our finest china and crystal, and the smell of my mother's famous prime rib filled the air. It should have been a night of warmth and family bonding, but instead it became the stage for my final humiliation. My father called me into his study at 6 o'clock, just as guests were beginning to arrive. My mother and Aunt Alice were there waiting, along with Brandon, who sat in the leather chair that had always been my grandfather's favorite spot. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. Brandon occupying the patriarch's seat while I stood before the family tribunal like a defendant awaiting sentence. My father's voice was cold and formal as he laid out the terms of what he called my path to redemption. I was to walk into the dining room in front of all the assembled guests, get down on my knees beside Brandon's chair, and publicly apologize for my jealousy and sabotage. The apology had to be specific and detailed, acknowledging each alleged transgression that Brandon had accused me of committing. I was to admit that my academic success had made me arrogant and cruel, that I couldn't bear to share my parents' love and attention, and that I had systematically attempted to destroy my brother's education out of spite and envy. But the humiliation didn't end there. My mother produced a handwritten letter that she expected me to sign and send to Harvard Law School's Dean of Students, formally confessing to academic misconduct and requesting withdrawal from the program. Another letter was prepared for submission to the local newspaper, where our family's social standing made us regular subjects of the lifestyle section. This letter would publicly acknowledge my behavior and praise Brandon's character and resilience in overcoming my attempts to sabotage his future. The ultimatum was clear and devastating. If I performed this public ritual of humiliation and signed these letters destroying my academic and professional future, I would be allowed to remain in the family home and they would pay for me to attend a local community college to pursue some appropriate career path like early childhood education or administrative support. If I refused, I would be immediately disowned, cut off financially, and forced to leave the house that very evening with nothing but the clothes on my back. Brandon watched this proceeding with barely concealed satisfaction, occasionally interjecting with additional demands for specificity in my required apology. He wanted me to acknowledge that I had always been jealous of his natural charisma and social skills, that I had resented his ability to make friends easily while I struggled with social connections. He demanded that I admit to trying to poison our parents against him through years of subtle manipulation and false accusations about his character. When I refused, the reaction was swift and brutal. I looked my father directly in the eye and told him that I would rather die than apologize for something I didn't do, that integrity was more important to me than comfort or family acceptance, and that if they couldn't see through Brandon's manipulation after 20 years of knowing my character, then they didn't deserve to have me as a daughter. The words hung in the air like a declaration of war. My mother's face went white with shock and anger, my father's jaw clenched with the kind of rage I'd only seen him display toward business competitors who had crossed him, and Aunt Alice shook her head with what looked like genuine sadness and disappointment. Brandon's mask finally slipped for just a moment. As my parents processed my refusal, he looked directly at me with a smile that was pure malice and whispered just loud enough for me to hear, "You should have known better than to cross me, sister. This is just the beginning of what I can do to you." My father stood up slowly, his business persona taking over as he delivered what felt like a corporate termination notice. My Harvard Law School tuition payments would be canceled immediately. My health insurance would be terminated at midnight. My name would be removed from all family financial accounts, trusts, and inheritance documents. I had exactly 30 minutes to pack a single bag and leave the house permanently. My mother, the woman who had given birth to me and supposedly loved me unconditionally, looked at me with eyes full of contempt as she said, "You are no longer my daughter." A real daughter would choose family over pride, would value reconciliation over being right. Since you clearly care more about your reputation than your family's happiness, you can go build your precious integrity somewhere else. Aunt Alice, who had been my champion and supporter for my entire life, silently handed me an envelope containing exactly $200 in cash and the spare key to my own bedroom, making it clear that I was now officially a guest being evicted rather than a family member going through a rough patch. The next 30 minutes passed in a blur of surreal disconnection. I packed my laptop, some clothes, important documents, and the few pieces of jewelry my grandmother had given me over the years. I could hear the party continuing downstairs, Christmas music and laughter creating a bizarre soundtrack to my exile. When I came downstairs with my single duffel bag, some of the guests had apparently been told that I was leaving for a special Christmas trip, because several people wished me safe travels and happy holidays with genuine warmth. Brandon stood in the foyer watching my departure, no longer bothering to hide his satisfaction. As I opened the front door to step out into the freezing December night, he called out loud enough for everyone to hear, "I hope you find whatever you're looking for out there, Sadie. Maybe being on your own will teach you the value of family." The cold hit me like a physical blow as I stepped outside into the Christmas Eve snowstorm. The wind was howling through the bare tree branches, and the snow was falling so heavily that I could barely see the end of our driveway. I stood there for a moment, completely overwhelmed by the reality of my situation. I had nowhere to go, no way to get there, and almost no money to my name. Jake was out of the question after our painful breakup. Melissa had made it clear that associating with me was too risky for her reputation, and most of my other college friends were home with their families for Christmas break. I started walking toward the main road, my duffel bag growing heavier with each step as the snow soaked through the fabric. My childhood neighborhood looked like a winter wonderland, with every house decorated with twinkling lights and warm glows emanating from windows where families were celebrating together. The contrast between their apparent happiness and my desperate situation was almost too much to bear. I felt like a character from a Dickens novel, the orphan walking through the snow while everyone else enjoyed their Christmas feasts. My phone, which my parents hadn't thought to confiscate since they'd canceled my service plan, was down to 15% battery when it started buzzing with an unknown number at exactly 11:47 p.m. I almost didn't answer, assuming it was some kind of prank call or wrong number, but something made me swipe to accept the call. The voice on the other end was crisp and professional, with the kind of refined accent that suggested expensive education and high-level legal practice. "Miss Mitchell? This is Theodore Whitman from Whitman, Sterling and Associates. I apologize for calling so late on Christmas Eve, but I've been trying to reach you regarding your grandmother's estate. Dorothy Mitchell passed away yesterday evening, and her will contains some rather urgent provisions that require immediate attention. My first thought was confusion, followed quickly by grief. Grandma Dorothy had been my closest family ally, the one person who seemed to see through Brandon's manipulation and value my authentic self. She lived in a modest apartment across town and lived such a simple lifestyle that I'd assumed she was surviving primarily on Social Security and my grandfather's small pension. She'd always been supportive of my education but claimed she couldn't afford to help financially, which I'd completely understood and respected. Mr. Whitman continued speaking, and his words started to sound increasingly surreal. Miss Mitchell, I need to inform you that you are the sole beneficiary of what turns out to be a substantial estate. Your grandmother was actually worth significantly more than anyone in your family realized, and she left specific instructions about how her assets should be distributed and under what circumstances. He explained that Grandma Dorothy had requested an emergency meeting for that very evening, despite the holiday, because her will contain time-sensitive provisions related to my current family situation. His office was only 20 minutes away, and he offered to send a car to pick me up immediately if I was willing to meet with him to discuss the inheritance. The car that arrived was a sleek black sedan with heated leather seats and classical music playing softly through premium speakers. The driver was professional and courteous, offering me tissues and a bottle of water without asking questions about why a young woman was standing alone in a snowstorm on Christmas Eve. During the drive, I tried to process what Mr. Whitman had told me, but it seemed impossible that my humble grandmother could have left me anything more than a few $1,000s and some sentimental jewelry. Mr. Whitman's office building was impressive even in the dark, with marble columns and brass fixtures that spoke of old money and established power. His office took up an entire floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Boston Harbor and antique furniture that probably cost more than most people's cars. He was a distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and kind eyes that immediately put me at ease despite the strange circumstances. Miss Mitchell, he began, your grandmother was a remarkable woman who lived far beneath her means in order to observe the true character of her family members. Dorothy Mitchell founded and operated one of the most successful property development companies in Massachusetts history, accumulating assets worth approximately $200 million over the course of 50 years. The number was so large that it didn't immediately register as real. $200 million was the kind of money that existed in movies and news articles about tech billionaires, not in the life of a woman who clipped grocery store coupons and darned her own socks. Mr. Whitman opened a thick folder and began reading from what appeared to be a handwritten journal. Your grandmother kept detailed observations about every member of your family for decades. She was particularly interested in how each person treated others when they believed no one important was watching, and how they responded to adversity and pressure. He read several entries from her journal, and her assessment of my character brought tears to my eyes. She had noticed every instance of kindness I'd shown to service workers, every time I'd helped struggling classmates with their studies, every occasion when I'd stood up for fairness even when it cost me personally. She'd also documented Brandon's behavior in detail, noting his manipulation tactics, his treatment of people he considered beneath his status, and his pattern of taking credit for others' work while avoiding accountability for his own failures. Sadie is the only one with integrity and strength, one entry read. She works harder than anyone else and expects less credit than she deserves. She treats people with respect regardless of their position or usefulness to her, and she maintains her principles even when it's difficult. Brandon, on the other hand, is charming and manipulative but fundamentally dishonest. He has learned to tell people what they want to hear while pursuing his own agenda ruthlessly. The inheritance included Dorothy Holdings, her real estate empire with properties across New England valued at over $120 million. There was a Swiss bank account containing $80 million in liquid assets, carefully invested over decades to grow steadily without attracting attention from family members who might have changed their behavior if they'd known about her wealth. Her art collection, which I'd assumed consisted of small prints and local paintings, actually included several pieces by major American artists worth $30 million combined. But the most valuable part of the inheritance wasn't financial. Grandma Dorothy had spent years quietly investigating Brandon's background and behavior, hiring private detectives and forensic accountants to document his patterns of deception and fraud. She had compiled irrefutable evidence of his academic cheating, his manipulation of family dynamics, and even his involvement in financial schemes that went far beyond what my family knew about. The will contained one crucial condition that revealed the depth of my grandmother's wisdom and foresight. I could only access the inheritance if I used it responsibly to protect other innocent people from similar manipulation and abuse. The money couldn't be used for personal revenge or luxury, but it could be used to seek justice, expose truth, and prevent Brandon from harming others in the future. Mr. Whitman's office became my war room for the next week. With virtually unlimited financial resources and my grandmother's detailed intelligence files, I began assembling a team of experts who specialized in exposing fraud and manipulation. The first person we brought on board was Marcus Stone, a former FBI investigator who had built a reputation as one of the most thorough and ethical private detectives in New England. Marcus had worked on cases involving academic fraud, identity theft, and sophisticated manipulation schemes, making him perfectly suited to unravel Brandon's web of deception. Diana Chin joined our team as our digital forensics specialist. She had a PhD in computer science from MIT and had developed techniques for identifying deepfake videos and other digital manipulation that were considered cutting-edge even by law enforcement standards. Diana's initial analysis of the videos Brandon had created to frame me revealed digital fingerprints and technical flaws that clearly identified them as sophisticated forgeries. Our legal team was headed by the prestigious firm Goldman & Associates, whose senior partners had experience with complex fraud cases and academic misconduct investigations. They assured me that we had the resources and expertise to not only clear my name but to pursue criminal charges against Brandon for his elaborate fraud scheme. The evidence we uncovered in the first week was staggering in its scope and sophistication. Marcus discovered that Brandon's cheating at Boston College was just the tip of the iceberg. He had actually been running a coordinated academic fraud operation involving at least 12 students across 3 different universities. Students paid him substantial fees to provide them with stolen test questions, forged transcripts, and even hired surrogates to take exams on their behalf. The operation had been generating over $50,000 per semester for Brandon, money that he'd been using to fund his elaborate lifestyle and pay for the technology he used to manipulate our family. Diana's analysis of my hacked email accounts revealed that Brandon had been intercepting and reading my personal communications for over 2 years. He had installed sophisticated spyware on every device I used when visiting home, giving him access to my passwords, personal conversations, and confidential academic work. He'd used this information to stay ahead of my academic achievements and to gather intelligence that he could use to undermine my relationships and reputation. Even more disturbing was the discovery that Brandon had been systematically manipulating other family members for years. He had been intercepting mail intended for my parents, including financial documents and correspondence that might have revealed information unfavorable to him. He'd been recording private conversations in our house using hidden devices, then editing the recordings to create false impressions about family members' opinions and intentions. Our investigation revealed that Professor Williams at Harvard had actually tried multiple times to contact me directly about the suspicious emails allegedly sent from my account. Brandon had been intercepting these communications and preventing me from receiving them, while simultaneously feeding false information to the Harvard administration about my supposed refusal to cooperate with their investigation. We found evidence that Brandon had been building fake social media profiles and online personas for over 3 years, using them to spread rumors about me in academic and social circles. He'd created elaborate backstories for these fake profiles, complete with photographs stolen from other social media accounts and carefully crafted personal histories that made them seem like legitimate sources of information about my character and behavior. The financial trail was equally damning. Banking records showed that Brandon had been receiving payments from the students involved in his academic fraud operation, but he'd also been extorting money from some of them by threatening to expose their participation if they didn't continue paying him additional fees. He'd been using multiple fake identities and shell companies to hide these transactions from law enforcement and university authorities. Our team also discovered that this wasn't Brandon's first time targeting a family member for systematic destruction. Through our investigation into his background before the adoption, we learned that he'd been removed from 2 previous foster families after what were described as concerning behavioral patterns involving manipulation and false accusations against other children in the homes. Sarah, Brandon's ex-girlfriend from high school, agreed to meet with our investigators after being assured of protection from retaliation. She revealed that Brandon had shown her detailed plans he'd drawn up for managing our family dynamics to ensure that he remained the favored child. He'd studied psychology books about family systems and manipulation tactics, and he'd actually practiced different scenarios for how to turn family members against each other if anyone ever threatened his position. Mrs. Garcia, our family housekeeper, finally felt safe enough to come forward with her own testimony after being assured of legal protection and immigration support if needed. She revealed that Brandon had been threatening her for months, not just about her immigration status but about her family members who still lived in El Salvador. He'd convinced her that he had connections who could harm her relatives if she ever spoke against him. Professor Williams from Harvard agreed to cooperate fully with our investigation once he understood the scope of Brandon's fraud operation. He'd actually been suspicious of the emails allegedly sent from my account because the writing style and vocabulary were completely different from my usual communication patterns. He'd tried to verify their authenticity but had been prevented from reaching me directly by Brandon's interference with my communications. Most importantly, we discovered that Brandon had been planning to expand his fraud operation significantly. He'd been researching graduate school admission processes, professional licensing examinations, and even bar exam procedures with the goal of creating a comprehensive academic fraud service that could help wealthy students cheat their way through higher education for substantial fees. The formal hearing at Harvard Law School was scheduled for January 15, giving us 3 weeks to prepare our presentation of evidence. The hearing room was intimidating, with dark wood paneling, formal portraits of distinguished legal scholars, and a large conference table where the investigative committee would review our case. Dean Richardson presided over the hearing, flanked by 4 senior faculty members including Professor Williams and 2 external experts in academic integrity. Brandon arrived with his own legal team, apparently confident that his original fabricated evidence would be sufficient to maintain his false narrative. He'd dressed carefully for the occasion in a conservative suit that made him look like the earnest victim he'd been portraying, and he carried a leather portfolio that presumably contained additional false evidence to support his claims. Our presentation began with Diana's technical analysis of the deepfake videos that had been used to frame me. Using large monitors and sophisticated software, she walked the committee through the digital forensic process that revealed clear evidence of manipulation. She showed them pixel-level analysis that identified artifacts from the face mapping software Brandon had used, audio analysis that revealed voice cloning techniques, and metadata that proved the videos had been created using professional video editing equipment rather than captured from real events. The committee members were visibly shocked as Diana demonstrated how sophisticated and convincing the fake videos appeared to casual viewing, but how clearly fraudulent they became under expert analysis. Professor Williams commented that he'd seen similar deepfake technology used in criminal cases but had never encountered it in an academic setting. Marcus presented the financial evidence next, using banking records and transaction histories to show the committee exactly how Brandon's academic fraud operation worked. The paper trail was devastating, showing payments from multiple students, complex money laundering schemes, and evidence that Brandon had been expanding his operation to include universities beyond Boston College. The committee was particularly disturbed by evidence that Brandon had been specifically targeting international students who were vulnerable due to language barriers and immigration concerns. He'd been charging them premium rates for his services while threatening to report them to immigration authorities if they tried to stop participating in his fraud schemes. When we presented the evidence of Brandon's systematic manipulation of my family relationships, including the intercepted communications and forged documents, the committee began to understand the true scope of his deception. Professor Williams testified that the suspicious emails allegedly sent from my account had displayed writing patterns completely inconsistent with my previous communications, but that his attempts to verify their authenticity had been blocked by what he now understood was Brandon's interference. Brandon's response to our evidence was telling. Instead of providing counter-evidence or logical explanations, he became increasingly emotional and defensive. He accused our team of fabricating evidence against him, claimed that I was using my family's wealth to buy false testimony, and suggested that the sophisticated digital analysis was itself fraudulent. His legal team tried to argue that the evidence against him was circumstantial and that there could be innocent explanations for some of the financial transactions. But when Diana presented audio recordings that Brandon himself had made of family conversations, recordings that included his own voice discussing his manipulation strategies, their defense began to crumble. The most damning evidence came from Brandon's own digital devices. When faced with a court order to surrender his computers and phones for forensic analysis, additional evidence emerged that he'd never intended us to find. His browsing history showed extensive research into identity theft techniques, academic fraud methods, and psychological manipulation tactics. His document files contained detailed profiles he'd created of every family member, including specific strategies for exploiting their emotional vulnerabilities and turning them against each other. We found drafts of additional fake emails he'd been planning to send, scripts for phone calls he intended to make while impersonating other people, and even preliminary research into methods for accessing my trust fund and inheritance information. The evidence showed that destroying my academic career and family relationships was just the first phase of a much larger plan to systematically take over our family's resources. During his testimony, Brandon's carefully maintained facade finally cracked completely. When confronted with irrefutable evidence of his fraud operation, he became angry and vindictive, making threats against committee members and revealing the manipulative personality that he'd hidden so carefully for years. His transformation from innocent victim to aggressive predator was so dramatic that several committee members commented on it in their written findings. The hearing concluded with Brandon's legal team requesting a recess to consider a plea agreement, essentially admitting defeat in the face of overwhelming evidence. The committee's preliminary finding was that I had been the victim of an elaborate and malicious fraud scheme, and that Harvard Law School owed me a formal apology for the investigation that should never have occurred. Outside the hearing room, Brandon made one final attempt at manipulation by approaching me directly to suggest that we could work together to minimize the consequences for both of us. He proposed that if I agreed to drop the criminal charges against him, he would confess to academic misconduct but claim it was a one-time mistake rather than an ongoing fraud operation. When I refused, he showed his true nature one last time by threatening that he would find ways to destroy me even from prison. The criminal trial began in March, in Suffolk County Superior Court with Judge Patricia Montgomery presiding. The courtroom was packed with media representatives, Harvard faculty members, students from multiple universities who had been affected by Brandon's fraud operation, and several members of my extended family who had finally begun to understand the scope of his deception. Brandon faced multiple felony charges: identity theft, wire fraud, computer crimes, extortion, and racketeering related to his multi-university fraud operation. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Jennifer Walsh, had built their case around the extensive evidence we'd gathered, supplemented by testimony from victims across 3 states who had been affected by Brandon's schemes. Brandon's defense strategy was desperate and increasingly unhinged. His attorneys tried to argue that he was the victim of childhood trauma from losing his parents, that the pressure to succeed in our family had driven him to make poor decisions, and that my family's wealth and connections were being used to frame him for crimes he didn't commit. They portrayed him as a vulnerable young man who had made some mistakes but was being unfairly prosecuted by powerful interests who wanted to protect their own reputation. The prosecution systematically destroyed this narrative by presenting evidence of Brandon's careful planning and sophisticated execution of his fraud schemes. They showed that his criminal behavior had begun years before any academic pressure could have been a factor, and that he'd been researching and planning his manipulation tactics since high school. Sarah, Brandon's ex-girlfriend, provided devastating testimony about conversations where Brandon had explicitly outlined his plans to exploit our family's resources and eliminate me as competition for their attention and financial support. She testified that he'd shown her detailed psychological profiles he'd created of each family member, complete with strategies for manipulating their emotions and turning them against each other. The financial evidence presented during the trial revealed that Brandon's fraud operation had generated over $300,000 in illegal income over 4 years. He'd been investing this money in cryptocurrency and offshore accounts, apparently planning to disappear with his accumulated wealth once he'd gained complete control over our family's assets. Multiple students testified about how Brandon had exploited their desperation and fear to force them into participating in his fraud schemes. Several international students described how he threatened to report them to immigration authorities if they stopped paying him, while other students testified about academic careers that had been destroyed when Brandon's schemes were discovered by university administrators. The testimony from computer experts was particularly compelling. They demonstrated exactly how Brandon had created the deepfake videos used to frame me, showing the jury sophisticated equipment he'd purchased and detailed tutorials he'd studied to learn digital manipulation techniques. The technical complexity of his schemes proved that this wasn't a series of impulsive mistakes but a carefully planned criminal enterprise. Mrs. Garcia's testimony brought several jury members to tears as she described how Brandon had threatened her family members in El Salvador and forced her to lie about my behavior. She testified about finding recording equipment hidden in our house and being forced to report false information about family conversations to Brandon. Professor Williams testified about the sophisticated nature of Brandon's academic fraud and the extensive damage it had caused to multiple university communities. He explained how Brandon's schemes had undermined trust between students and faculty, created unfair advantages for wealthy students who could afford his services, and damaged the integrity of higher education. During his own testimony, Brandon attempted to maintain his victim narrative but was systematically dismantled by the prosecution's cross-examination. When presented with audio recordings of his own voice discussing manipulation strategies, financial records of his fraud income, and digital evidence of his criminal activities, he became increasingly hostile and revealed the true nature of his personality to the jury. The most dramatic moment of the trial came when the prosecution played recordings that Brandon had made of family dinners, recordings where he could be heard subtly manipulating conversations to turn family members against me. The jury was able to hear firsthand how skillfully he'd engineered conflicts and misunderstandings, painting himself as innocent while systematically destroying my relationships with people who had loved and trusted me. Brandon's sentencing hearing provided an opportunity for victims to address the court directly. I spoke about the psychological trauma of being betrayed by someone I'd tried to love as a brother, the academic and professional consequences of his fraud schemes, and the importance of holding him accountable to prevent him from targeting other families in the future. The judge sentenced Brandon to 15 years in federal prison followed by 5 years of supervised probation. She specifically noted the sophisticated and predatory nature of his crimes, the extensive planning involved, and the vulnerability of many of his victims. The sentence included restitution payments to all identified victims and a permanent ban on enrolling in any accredited educational institution. Outside the courthouse, my parents approached me for the first time since Christmas Eve. My father's face showed a combination of shame, regret, and genuine remorse that I'd never seen before. He spoke quietly about how sorry he was for believing Brandon's lies, for failing to protect me from manipulation, and for causing me to lose trust in the people who should have supported me unconditionally. My mother was openly crying as she asked if there was any way to repair our relationship and rebuild the family bonds that Brandon's manipulation had destroyed. She acknowledged that her favoritism toward Brandon had been wrong regardless of his lies, and that I deserved to be valued and supported as their biological daughter. Aunt Alice presented me with a handwritten letter that she'd worked on for weeks, detailing every instance where she should have questioned Brandon's version of events and supported me instead. She asked not for immediate forgiveness but for the opportunity to prove over time that she could be the aunt and family advocate that I'd needed all along. 2 years have passed since that snowy Christmas Eve when I stood outside my family's house with nothing but a duffel bag and shattered trust. As I sit in my downtown Boston office, looking out at the harbor where my grandmother's wisdom and resources helped me build something meaningful from the ashes of betrayal, I can honestly say that being forced to stand on my own was the greatest gift I could have received. I graduated from Harvard Law School summa cum laude, with my thesis on academic fraud prevention being published in the Harvard Law Review and cited by universities across the country as they developed new integrity policies. The firm I established, Mitchell & Associates, specializes in representing victims of fraud and manipulation, particularly students and young professionals who have been targeted by predatory schemes. The Dorothy Foundation, named in honor of my grandmother's wisdom and foresight, has provided legal support to over 200 students who were falsely accused of academic misconduct. We've also developed educational programs that teach young people how to recognize manipulation tactics and protect themselves from psychological exploitation by family members, romantic partners, and authority figures. My relationship with my parents has slowly healed through months of family therapy and countless difficult conversations about favoritism, communication, and the importance of supporting children unconditionally. They've worked hard to understand how their treatment of Brandon versus their treatment of me created an environment where manipulation could flourish. While our relationship will never be exactly what it was before, it's now built on a foundation of honest communication and mutual respect rather than unexamined assumptions and emotional patterns. Aunt Alice has become one of my strongest supporters and closest advisors. She serves on the board of the Dorothy Foundation and has dedicated significant time to helping other families recognize and address manipulation dynamics before they cause lasting damage. Her genuine remorse and consistent actions to make amends have allowed us to rebuild our relationship stronger than it ever was before. Jake reached out to me 6 months after the trial, asking if we could meet to discuss what had happened between us. He offered a sincere apology for doubting me and explained how skillfully Brandon had manipulated his perceptions and emotions. While I appreciated his honesty and regret, too much had changed in both of our lives to rebuild our romantic relationship. We've maintained a friendship based on mutual respect and shared understanding of how manipulation can damage even the closest relationships. I met David at a legal conference where we were both presenting research on fraud prevention. He's a prosecutor who specializes in cases involving vulnerable victims, and he understood immediately why my work was so important to me. Our relationship has grown slowly and carefully, built on shared values and honest communication about our past experiences and future goals. He's seen me at my strongest and most vulnerable moments, and his consistent support and respect have helped me trust completely again. Brandon has written several letters from prison, initially angry and threatening but gradually becoming more reflective and remorseful. His most recent letter included what appeared to be a genuine apology for the pain he'd caused and an acknowledgement of the sophisticated nature of his manipulation tactics. While I've read his letters, I haven't responded to them. My focus is on moving forward and helping others rather than dwelling on past betrayals. The most profound lesson I've learned is that true strength doesn't come from avoiding adversity but from maintaining your integrity and values when everything around you is falling apart. When my entire family believed lies about me, when evidence was fabricated to destroy my reputation, when people I loved and trusted turned against me, I had to decide who I wanted to be in the face of that challenge. I learned that family isn't just about blood relationships or legal adoptions. It's about the people who choose to support and believe in you when it would be easier to walk away. It's about surrounding yourself with individuals who value truth over convenience, who ask questions instead of making assumptions, and who stand by you even when doing so requires courage and sacrifice. The greatest gift my grandmother gave me wasn't the financial inheritance that allowed me to fight back against Brandon's manipulation. It was her example of watching, evaluating, and making decisions based on people's actions rather than their words. She taught me that real character is revealed not in moments of triumph but in how people treat others when they think no one important is watching. Today, I work with families across the country who are dealing with manipulation, fraud, and betrayal within their own homes. I've seen that Brandon's tactics aren't unique or uncommon. Many families struggle with members who exploit emotional bonds for personal gain, who turn loved ones against each other for strategic advantage, and who use trust and intimacy as weapons rather than gifts. The work is difficult and sometimes heartbreaking, but it's also incredibly rewarding. When I help a young person recognize that they're being gaslighted by a family member, when I provide legal support for someone who's been falsely accused by a manipulative relative, when I see a family learn to communicate honestly and support each other unconditionally, I know that my grandmother's wisdom and sacrifice are creating positive change in the world. As I finish writing this story, I want to thank everyone who has followed this journey and supported me through sharing your own experiences and insights. Your comments and messages have shown me that manipulation and betrayal within families are far more common than most people realize, and that there's tremendous value in sharing these stories to help others recognize similar patterns in their own lives. I'd love to hear from you about your own experiences with family dynamics, manipulation, or the process of rebuilding trust after betrayal. Have you ever faced a situation where you had to choose between family acceptance and personal integrity? How did you handle relationships with people who believed lies about you? What advice would you give to someone who's currently dealing with a manipulative family member? Please share your thoughts and stories in the comments below, hit that like button if this story resonated with you, and subscribe to hear more stories about overcoming adversity and finding strength in unexpected places. Your engagement and support help these stories reach people who need to hear them most. Share this video with anyone who might benefit from understanding manipulation tactics or who could use encouragement about standing up for truth even when it's difficult and costly. Sometimes the most important gift we can give someone is the knowledge that they're not alone in their struggle and that integrity is worth fighting for. Thank you for taking this journey with me, and I hope that sharing my story helps you in your own process of building authentic relationships and protecting yourself from those who would exploit your trust and love. Remember that you deserve to be surrounded by people who value and support the real you, not people who want to manipulate you into being someone who serves their agenda. May you always have the courage to choose truth over convenience, integrity over acceptance, and authentic relationships over manipulative ones. The people who truly belong in your life will value and support these choices, while those who don't probably don't deserve a place in your story anyway.